Our next speaker is Dr. Neil Frank, and he's going to be talking about severe weather and hurricanes. Dr. Frank?
Anthony, I have written numerous letters to the Houston Chronicle. They published one. And they editized that so it destroyed the very thing that I was trying to convince them to. It's unreal. How many Texans are in the group? I'm curious. October the 17th is an important date because it's the latest we've ever had a hurricane on the Texas coast. So now we're sliding into the next hurricane season. Now, at the threat of going over a little bit of my time, Anthony, I've been asked by several people to kind of discuss my journey to becoming a skeptic.
All right.
Because I wasn't a skeptic in the 80s. Matter of fact, when Hansen made his statement on June the 6th, 1988, and said we are destroying the planet with carbon dioxide, I didn't question him. He was the expert.
You and I both had the same experience.
Yeah,
I was watching.
no problem. So we've got a problem. Well, that summer, Bill Gray showed up. Now, I don't know whether all of you know Bill Gray or not, but he was the one that started forecasting the number of storms that we'd have every year. He used to come down to the Hurricane Center every summer. And he walked in the office, and his first statement, he said, the numerical models are wrong. They're wrong. And Dr. Judy Curry actually accused him of having a fossilized mind some later, if some of you know Judy Curry. And he said, have you looked at the data? And I said, no, I don't have time to. So he went back home, and a few days later, I got a package in the mail. Patrick Michaels, is it Sound and Fury if Patrick is in there? Patrick Michaels' book on Sound and Fury. Now, I knew that Bill was coming back next summer, so I thought, I got to read this book so at least I can carry out an intelligent conversation with him. Well, that opened my eyes, and I began to see for the first time, like Anthony, that there was something wrong with this. And then in 2000, roughly, we hit the pause, exactly as Bill Gray predicted. All the numerical models were wrong, but Bill was right. So the pause really influenced me. Then we had the scandal in 2010? The e-Markles? Yeah. And there was 20,000 or so emails, and a major, that really affected me. There's no question about that. Fred Singer had his office in the same place that I was located. And as a matter of fact, his book, that you're Republican, I have one of the first copies of that. Fred Singer. And he was the chairman of the Department of Meteorology at the time, the University of Miami. We were co-located there. And then I read Patrick Moore's book on the confession of a Greenpeace dropout. That did it. That did it. I became a skeptic from thereafter. There's no question about it. Now, in the process of reading a lot of material, if I can have the first graphic now, I ran across an interesting book by Mark Levine on freedom of the press. And in this book, he has a chapter on shaping public opinion. And he said we shape public opinion by three, and particularly if we're trying to convince people of something that happened that is not true. We shape public opinion by lying, by omission of critical information, and propaganda. And the thing that attracted me to the book is he uses climate change as a classic example of propaganda. And there's been no question over the last several years that we've been lied to. James, you pointed out a number of the ways that we've been lied to. And activists at the present time are telling us that unless we stop burning fossil fuels and spewing this nasty carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere, then we're going to have astronomical changes, and we are already exerting those changes in a number of meteorological events. And it seems like to me they've kind of zeroed on 5 of the events. And James, you touched, I think, on each one of them. How about droughts? They're lying to us. They're not increasing. Incidentally, the spike on your drought, that was in the 30s. Some of you would be interested that I was a preteen in northwest Kansas in the dust storm. And let me tell you, I have not seen anything in recent years compared to what I saw at that particular time. How about wildfires? We're being lied to. How about changes of the ocean? We're being lied to. But one thing I would say, the earth is as warm as it's ever been in recorded history. James, you pointed out that omission of that statement is that recorded history only goes back to 1880. And let me tell you something. The earth is warmed for the last 150 years, and I'm delighted that it has. I don't know about you, but I don't want to go back to good old days when Washington was in Valley Forge, or millions of people died because of the cold and crop failure. Well, how about then storms? You've already pointed out, James, that there's been no change in the tornadoes. That brings us to hurricanes. 2020. 30 named storms. A new record. We've never seen anything like that, although we had 28 in 2005, and then again in 1933, we'd had 21. Finally, the activist has something that they can point to. Look at this. This is because of global warming. And if you look at the raw data, now this shows the number of hurricanes, that would be red, the number of tropical storms, that would be yellow, from 1850 all the way over to the right. And if you take a look at the raw data, there's no question that we're seeing a significant increase. Maybe that's associated with global warming. But I'm going to make a statement here today. I'm going to point out 3 reasons why I don't believe that the 2020 was that much of a historical year. And in order to do that, the first point I want to make is that hurricanes tend to occur in cycles. Now, Stan Goldenberg and a number of his group pointed out several years ago that bad hurricanes, the category 3, 4, or 5, or ones with winds in excess of 110 miles an hour, love warm water. And we see an increase of major hurricanes when the ocean is warm. And the ocean in the Atlantic and the Pacific undergo a 60-year cycle. They warm for 30 years and they cool 30 years. I happen to believe that that's probably in response to the Earth's temperature. Now, the blue there would be the Earth's temperature since 1880, and you've seen this with James, and others have shown you the same thing. But just prior to 1880, we came out of the little ice age, so there was a significant warming then. Then we cooled to 1910, we warmed to 1940, another cooling period, a significant cooling until 1975, and then we plateaued out in 1998. Now let's superimpose the Earth's temperature over top of the graph that shows the hurricane. There have been 3 warm periods over the last 150 years. Now, if you look carefully at the bottom graph, you'll see an increase in hurricanes in each of those warm periods. If anything, the increase in hurricanes lags a little behind the Earth's temperature. Let's go to the left-hand side now. We're talking about just prior to the 1900s. So we're talking about the late 1980s. We came out of the little ice age, and there was significant storms in. Matter of fact, in terms of hurricane landfalls, 1880 holds the record when there was 7 hurricanes made landfall in the Gulf of Mexico, 4 of them in Texas alone, 2 of them, those were major, and the one major storm destroyed Indianola. Indianola was a very thriving seaport on the south shore of Matagorda Bay, about 60 miles southwest of Houston. And in the mid-1800s, a very active coastal community developed there. And at one time, there were 20,000 people lived in that community, and shipping from the northeast would come down to Indianola and offload there. And then in this active hurricane period, 1875, a Category 4 storm came across Indianola, did a lot of damage. They rebuilt, and in 1886, they decided to abandon. And there's nothing left there but a cemetery that had headstones, 1875, 1886. And there was some other bad hurricanes in the late 1800s. How about Hilton Head Island? In 1893, 2,000 people died there. And in 1893, we also had 2,000 people die on Grand Isle. And I was amused at the comments this last year when Ida went by there. We've never seen anything like that. Yeah, we have. 150 years ago, as a matter of fact, Grand Isle was almost destroyed. And in 1856, another storm destroyed what is called Last Isle. This was an island very near Grand Isle, a very upscale island where rich people in New Orleans went down and spent their summer. Then we saw a cooling from 1880 to 1910. That would be the blue line. And then another significant warming until 1940. And that was introduced by 21 storms in 1933. And how about the 40s when 11 storms hit Florida? 7 of them were major. And in the 50s, it was major hurricanes up the east coast of the United States. Then we went into a cool period from about 1940 to 1975. Those of you that are knowledgeable, remember we were headed for a little ice age. The consensus, so much for consensus, by all international experts is that we were headed for a little ice age. Well, you can see there was a downturn in hurricane activity at that time. I served as the director there in the late 70s and the 80s, and when I was the director of the Hurricane Center, the average number of storms was 10. Then we turned around and warmed up till 1998. And we were introduced into this new warming period by 19 storms in 1995. Now, the point that I'm trying to make to you is that we're in an active hurricane period. We would expect to have more storms during this period of time, and we have. But another important factor is we have a new observing tool that took place during this active period. That would be satellites that came into their own about 1970. And the impact of satellites in the Atlantic on tropical storms can be seen in 2005. Now, I've drawn a vertical line, black line, down through the western Atlantic. That would be the eastern extent of reconnaissance planes. So we didn't have reconnaissance planes that could go on into the eastern Atlantic. We had 7 storms form in the eastern Atlantic in 2005 and never moved into the western Atlantic. How do we know that they were there? It was because of satellites. How about 1933 when we had 21 named storms? How many storms were recorded? In the eastern Atlantic, 0. Now, you can't tell me that we had an active hurricane season and nothing occurred in the eastern Atlantic. That raises an interesting question. What is the impact of satellite pictures on hurricane activity, particularly in the eastern Atlantic? So I went back and looked at 50 years before satellite and 50 years after satellite. The top line shows the 50 years before satellites. And between tropical storms and hurricanes, we were naming about 1 storm every 2 years. Now, I want you to notice that most of those were hurricanes. Not many tropical storms were recorded over in the eastern Atlantic. Now let's go to the bottom of the curve, and you can see in the last 50 years that we're up to 2 to 3 storms a year. And that's just because we have satellites. So between the fact that we were in an active period and we have a new observing tool, we're adding 3 to 5 storms a year over the quiet period in the 80s and the 90s. That doesn't add up to 30 storms in 2020. So the most important information that I have for you today is related to the real reason why I believe that we had a lot more storms. Because there's been a change in the philosophy of what we name. And that has really occurred in the last few years. In order to justify this statement, I need to talk a little bit about hurricane forms. One of the requirements for a hurricane is you have a pre-existing weather disturbance. Now, I want to divide the Atlantic into the tropical Atlantic south of 25 and the subtropical Atlantic north of 25. Now, in the tropical Atlantic, no question, but what is African disturbances that are very important. This is an example of hurricane in 2008 that came on into the Gulf of Mexico. We follow 40 to 50 of these African disturbances every year. And in an active period, those disturbances account for something in the order of 10 to 12 storms a year. And the energy process with these storms is very simple. It's thunderstorms. The disturbance causes thunderstorms, and if there's enough thunderstorms there, they heat the atmosphere, the hot air rises, and air goes spinning in at the surface, and if it reaches a threshold value, we put a name on it. Now, the types of development that take place in the northern Atlantic or in the subtropical Atlantic is entirely different. It occurs in the spring and primarily in the fall when a cold front moves off the coast and then stalls, as this one did in 2001 in Tropical Storm Barry. Then a little weather disturbance develops along that front. Now, the main energy source here is baroclinic. Now, some of you may not be familiar with that term, but baroclinic means you have cold air side by side warm air, and anytime you have that, the cold air tries to underride the warm air, and you get wind. So the initial energy process for this kind of a disturbance is baroclinic. But it is a good tropical storm when you have a lot of warm, moist air, and it causes thunderstorms. And at times, if there's enough thunderstorms, these systems can morph into a tropical storm, and the center part of them becomes a warm core. As a matter of fact, that is a legitimate reason why some of the hurricanes do form. But it creates a problem if you start putting names on them. Let's assume now that the main weather disturbance that I want to talk about develops off the coast of the Carolinas. It's a baroclinic disturbance, but it causes thunderstorms. And for the next 24, 36 hours, 48 hours, the thunderstorms really become active, and this system begins to turn over into a tropical storm. So we put a name on it. Now, as this system moves on north, it encounters colder water, the thunderstorms dissipate, and it taps into a new source of cold air, and it reverts back to a baroclinic system that goes charging into the North Atlantic. Well, what do? You put a name on it. Do you take a name off from it? Well, in 2020, they decided that that's what they would do, and that's what they've been doing in recent years. Now, the green would represent tropical storms, and the red would represent hurricanes. Look there in the North Atlantic how many short green lines you see. They put a name on it, and then in less than 2 days, they took a name off from it as it went on into the North Atlantic. Matter of fact, we named 8 of those storms. I'm going to call them baroclinic storms, in contrast to the ones that are the main energy source is thunderstorms. So we had 10 of those. I mean, we named a storm just before it crossed the coast of Portugal. I mean, we named everything that moved in the North Atlantic in 2020. That raises an interesting question. What happened before we had satellites and what happened after satellites? So I went back to a 25-year period before we had satellites, and we named about one, maybe, or less than one per year. Then we got satellites in 1970, and we began to see with the satellites the thunderstorms that developed out and around these disturbances. So we started naming some of those, 1 to 2 a year. Then beginning in 1995, for the next 25 years, we upped that to 4 a year. And then in 2017, the last 5 years, it's averaging 7 storms a year. And we named 34 storms, baroclinic storms, over the last 5 years in the North Atlantic. How does that compare to before we had satellites? Let's go back, and it doesn't make any difference which 5-year period you choose. I chose one of 1961 to 1965. We had 4 storms. The other observation I'll make is the storms, when we named them before we had satellites, generally were hurricanes. 75% of them were hurricanes. In other words, they were pretty strong storms. That raised an interesting question. How many storms did we have in the North Atlantic in 1933? 0. So I have a question to ask. Was the 2020 hurricane season really that much more active than 1933? So I thought it would be interesting to impose the same observing restrictions on 2020 that we had in 1933. There would be no satellites. There would be no reconnaissance. And I identified 13 storms that probably wouldn't have been named. Now, maybe the one with the hurricane would have been named. So that leaves 12 that could not have been named. Well, just maybe if we take 10 storms off of the record in 2020, then 1933 was still maybe one of the more active periods. And we're doing the same thing in this year. We've named 20 storms so far, and 11 of those have been with the Baroclinic. Two of those storms had a lifetime of 12 hours, one had a lifetime of 18 hours, and 2 of them had a lifetime of 24 hours. So the same restrictions, and we have 11 storms that might not have been in the record in the 1930s. So the 1933 could well be yet the most active hurricane period in the history of the North Atlantic. And James, you've already shown this. What about the reality of hurricane activity? Let's go worldwide. The bottom graph shows the number of hurricanes, typhoons worldwide. There's about 50 of these, and there's been a 5 to 10% decrease as we moved into the currently. Well, what about the Atlantic? Is there any indication of the trend in hurricane activity in the Atlantic? I submit to you that there's only one way that we can judge that, and that would be looking at the landfalling storms. That would be the 3, 4, or 5s in the lower 48. I concede to you that in the late 1800s, a tropical storm or Category 1 in a remote area might not be in the record books. But I think that any storm that had winds of 110 miles an hour or more is in the record book. This shows the number of major hurricanes that made landfall in the United States by decade. Over on the left-hand side, see that little increase there? That is the active period in the late 1800s. And then in the middle, you see the period in the 40s and the 50s. So there has been a decrease in hurricane activity in the Atlantic, and certainly a major decrease from the 40s and the 50s. I have one other point that I'd like to make. So what is the summary on that? Well, maybe, just maybe, the 2020 hurricane season wasn't more active than 1933, but more important is you cannot use the raw hurricane data to do research, as these very learned people did in 2005. Notice they took a weak period, the 70s and the 80s, and compared it to the strong period in the 90s and on into the early part of this century, and conclude the significant increase was consistent with global warming. No, absolutely not no. You cannot use the raw hurricane data to do research. Appreciate the opportunity to share it.
Thank you, Dr.